Hello and welcome to Politics Europe, your regular guide to the top stories in Brussels and Strasbourg. On today's programme, EU leaders have praised Germany and France for brokering a ceasefire in Ukraine. But as Russia still seems to have the upper hand, there are serious doubts about whether it will hold. There's general agreement that Greece and the Eurozone need to move from standoff to a solution. But with the deadline fast approaching, there's still no deal on the country's economic bailout. MEPs have backed the sharing of passenger data on all flights in Europe. But where does that leave our civil liberties? We're in Strasbourg to find out. And Hungary's been in the EU since 2004, but critics say the Prime Minister prefers looking east to Moscow and even China. We've been to Budapest to find out more. So all that to come and more in the next half hour. First, though, this week, members of the European Parliament have been meeting in Strasbourg for their regular plenary session, while in Brussels, EU leaders have been discussing the ceasefire in Ukraine and the deadlock over Greece's bailout. Here's Giles with our guide to all the latest from Europe in just 60 seconds.
MEPs want new labels on processed food showing where it's from following the horse meat scandal. They hope it'll help shoppers decide whether their supermarket lasagna might be beef or about to win the 2:30 at Epsom. Drivers who commit traffic offences in the EU can now be pursued here after MEPs agreed to share information. So if you're going to speed in Europe, make sure someone else is driving. The European Space Agency's prototype space shuttle splashed down after a 100-minute test flight. The IXV could pave the way for Europe's first reusable space plane. Marathon talks in Minsk produced a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. The leaders of Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine hammered out a deal overnight. But talks between Greece and its creditors broke down. They urgently need a plan for the country's debt crisis, but the Eurozone's 19 finance ministers didn't like the Greek offering. Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis said,
"We had many different interesting opinions."
He could have added, none of which anyone liked.
And with us for the next 30 minutes, I'm joined by the Labour MEP Nina Gill and the Plaid Cymru MEP Jill Evans. Welcome to both of you. Let's talk briefly about one of those stories, the ceasefire in the Ukraine. Are we right to be sceptical that, like the past ceasefires, Mr. Putin will probably break it?
Well, exactly. We've been there before. It's a bit like déjà vu. And clearly, you know, the indications today are the fighting is still continuing and there's still movement of armoury across the border.
Apparently he's been moving tanks into the eastern
Exactly. That
part.
doesn't seem to me like actions of somebody who's actually pulling support back. So I think we're in a really difficult situation. It seems to be we're having the Cold War scenario all over again.
And there are divisions in the West as well, divisions within Europe on how to handle this. And now it's clearly divisions between Chancellor Merkel and President Obama. Mr. Putin will be pretty good at exploiting that, I would suggest.
Well, yes, we need to be sceptical for many reasons, but I think we also need to look at what we welcome. One, of course, is President Putin's recognition that Ukraine is sovereign and the country's sovereignty. And
Do you think he means
it? We can only work towards that. And I think from a European Union perspective, what we need to be doing is everything possible to ensure this ceasefire lasts. We have been here before and we are all sceptical, but it's so important.
What else to do? OK, let's move on. We've got a lot to talk about. The meeting of EU leaders in Brussels yesterday was overshadowed by these attempts to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine, but that's not their only headache. The leaders were also grappling with what to do about Greece, because a deal with the country's new government over the bailout of the country is still proving elusive and threatens what was once unthinkable, that a country could be forced out of the Europe, either by accident or by design. Now, Syriza was elected in Athens last month on the promise to end austerity and what they called Greece's 5 years of humiliation and pain. The new Greek Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, said he would renegotiate Greece's massive international bailout. It's 240 billion euros is where it stands at. But the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has said that Europe's credibility depends on us sticking to the rules. That means the terms of the bailout. The clock's ticking because a deal has to be reached by the end of February when the current bailout plan comes to an end and has to be extended if the money's to continue. It would open the door to the possibility, if that doesn't happen, of Greece leaving the euro. It's the so-called Grexit. So far, there seems to be little sign of any common ground between the two sides. But Prime Minister Tsipras has agreed to meet with his creditors to find a mutually acceptable solution. Now, we're joined with the UKIP MEP Diane Jones and, of course, our other two guests. So I beg your pardon, Diane James. It even says James there. I just can't read properly. Would you like Greece to leave because of the shock and awe it would bring to Europe? Would you like that to happen?
Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? I mean,
Why?
Clearly the European Union as a concept is failing. But more importantly, Juncker went on record when he was made president that he wanted to see fiscal and political convergence for all of the 28 member states and for any new member state that will join. Now, if that's a route that all of the 28 member states sign up to, with all of the risks that that involves, and for the UK a huge risk because it would mean we would have to join the euro, then I would like to see that.
But
and
if Greece was forced to leave, or if Greece left in an emergency, not a planned departure, I mean, they may come to an agreement, but if they don't, I mean, there could be chaos in Greece. It could be even worse than it is now, and there could be contagion right across the Eurozone. More unemployment, more people suffering, more banks runs and so on. Do you really want that?
You've just absolutely highlighted what's wrong with the Eurozone, what's wrong with Euro membership. I don't see that sort of Armageddon, financial Armageddon that you're portraying. The nightmare for the European Union, for the commissioners, for Mr Juncker, is that actually Greece leaving would flourish and benefit, and within a relatively short time would actually start to get on its own 2 feet financially.
Now, you've been quite sympathetic to Syriza's anti-austerity position. Does that mean that you think that the Eurozone countries, the creditor countries, should agree to its core demand, which is a massive haircut on the outstanding debt?
I think that there has to be solidarity shown with the Greek people, and I think there has to be a change. I do think there will be an agreement.
But what's the answer to my question?
But yes, of course, because
so you think that you should write off a huge chunk of the Greek government's debt?
Well, it's impossible for Greece to pay the debts. They've had a series of impossible bailouts. The money has not been going to providing services for the people, and there's a real humanitarian crisis in Greece.
Okay,
Now,
I understand the reasons for doing it, and you're quite right that the size of Greek debts now, 176% of GDP, is probably unpayable even in the long run. But if you do that, why wouldn't Portugal then come knocking on the door and saying, right, we want a haircut too? Why wouldn't Spain? Why wouldn't Italy, where their national debt is now 135% of GDP? Why wouldn't they do that too?
Well, what I hope this marks is a change throughout Europe, and what we've been calling for is a conference and convention of all the debtor countries.
As has Syriza.
We can look at a different way of creating investment.
But do you think all these debts should be written off?
Well, the countries are willing to pay the debts. They are unable to pay the debts. So that it needs to be a system where countries can pay back the debts. But that's linked to growth and investment
Is that realistic?
as well.
I mean, the reason I ask is that the Greek debt now is not owned by the banks. I mean, the bailout socialised the debt is now owned by the German, the French, the Italian taxpayers.
Why should they pay? Why should they pay? There's no appetite across Europe for the people to pick up that tab. And that's quite clear. And I just want to go back on one of Diane's point. I mean, I don't think it's a good thing if Greece was to leave. We were discussing Ukraine before. What is happening bit by bit, this is Putin's policy, try and weaken Europe so that actually he can have a free hand on Eastern front. And I do think it's important we look at all of these things in a joined up way, because if Greece was to not get, let's say, in new terms, new negotiations, I don't think they should have a haircut, but I do think it's important that we recognise that the austerity policies that have been promoted have not worked, and what we do need now is greater policy for growth. So we need to target Juncker's investment plan more at countries like Greece to help them get growth so that they can pay their bills eventually.
Okay. What do you say to the point that, I mean, it's quite clear at the moment that Mr. Putin is moving to expand his sphere of influence and to minimise the importance of Europe. I mean, he's helping to bankroll parties like the National Front in France and some hard left parties. He's quite close to Syriza, actually.
And he's very close to UKIP
Greece.
too, leader.
Don't they just pick us off one by one?
I don't think he's picking us off one by one.
No, I'm saying if the European Union doesn't stick together, isn't that the danger?
Well, are you then advocating, Andrew?
I'm not advocating anything, I'm asking questions.
OK. I don't see him picking us off one by one. What has happened, let's go back to the fundamental issue on this programme this morning, which is, can Greece survive outside of the Eurozone? Would it be better outside of the Eurozone?
You think it could?
And I believe it could, and I believe there's no future for the Eurozone as it stands at the moment, and no amount of renegotiation is going to change that.
Regardless of your views, let me just very briefly get to what you think will happen. At the moment, there's a standoff between the financial ministers. The other parts of the Eurozone want Greece to extend the bailout and then talk about what reforms could be changed and so on. The Greek position is no, the bailout's over. We don't want to extend it. We want a bridging loan and discuss major reforms. They've only got till Monday, this coming Monday, the 16th, to agree. Will they or won't they?
I think they will in the end, because you can already see that there's been some degree of compromise. The language that's coming out, the body language, it is different.
All right.
Than
so
it was
you think?
before.
What do you think?
I think they will agree, and I welcome the fact that what we're seeing in this process is putting people back at the heart of the whole European project.
And what do you think?
I don't think they will agree. And how can they agree? The Greek people voted for that party. So my two colleagues here are then suggesting that we have another general election.
Okay, I just wanted your opinion. 2-1. And we shall see, because Monday's not far away. If they're going to agree, they better get on with it this week. Diane James.
Thank you.
Right, second time. Thank you for being with us. Now, MEPs this week back calls for all 28 EU member states to share information about airline passengers. This is really interesting. It's an initiative known as the EU Passenger Name Record, or PNR for short. It's previously been blocked by MEPs on civil liberties grounds, but was put back on the agenda after last month's attack on the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. Our Joko has been to Strasbourg to find out more about this.
Images that shocked the world. Journalists gunned down by homegrown terrorists at the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris, and later shoppers murdered at a Jewish supermarket. It united world leaders in a public show of solidarity and focused politicians' minds on tightening security for Europe's citizens. But how?
I think nobody in Europe can be immune from terrorism. I think it's a global threat, it's a lasting threat, it will not be removed easily. It can happen everywhere on the territory of Europe. I think our societies have to live with that. Unfortunately, we have to fight against that, but we have to live with that because this is a permanent threat.
This week, members of the European Parliament agreed to a package of counter-terrorism measures, including stepping up EU border checks, better information sharing on terrorist suspects between EU states, and more investment for de-radicalisation programmes. There are calls to go further and put in place a passenger names record system, collecting information on you when you fly in and out of the EU. Not just your flight details, but things like your mobile phone number and your bank details, and even what you eat on the plane. That data would be kept for up to 5 years and given to police and security services. But it's controversial.
It's not only on data protection, but it's really on the fundamental rights of each of us to not be surveyed blanketly, because there needs to be proportionality in place. Rule of law-based democracies have that, because that's the difference which we do to repressive regimes who just survey everybody, no matter if there is any suspicion or not.
Opponents of a PNR system for Europe are fighting a losing battle. The prospect of thousands of EU citizens currently in Syria, then returning home, has dramatically increased fears of more jihadi attacks on European soil. The Parliament's blocked any EU laws on data retention since 2013, backed by the European Court of Justice ruling that any blanket storage of information violated EU citizens' human rights. That resistance has crumbled.
And any mass collection of data, of course, is in sharp focus. So that's why on PNR we had to do our job properly. Quality legislation means that in any mass collection to fight terrorism, we also take care of people's privacy. That's our job, and we're doing it now. We're making the top priority fighting terrorism, but ensuring that privacy concerns are taken care of. We have the tools to do that job now, and we're going to do it effectively and carefully.
Balancing people's security and safeguarding civil liberties is always tricky. It's clear, though, there's now a cross-party consensus here at the European Parliament in favour of a new law to collect air passenger information, scheduled to be in place by the end of 2015.
That's our Joko. This is a really interesting issue, Jill Evans. You were against it. Why?
Well, because I want a really effective policy, as everyone does, and I don't agree that just the mass collection of data is going to be effective. What we need to do is look at what policies we have in place already. 239 different measures adopted in Europe over the past 15 years to counter terrorism.
But what specific? I understand that, but just what specifically do you object to most in this proposal? Is there a fear that the data will be misused, that it will undermine civil liberties? What is it?
Well, you need a balance between privacy and security, and I don't think that provides the balance.
No, I understand that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm trying to pin you down so we can get the... What is it you don't like about it?
Well, that data is collected on all of us.
No, we know that, but what don't you like?
Well, it's not necessary, and it's more effective if that is targeted. The surveillance that we have so far, the security forces can identify people. They have suspects. They need the resources
instead
and the
of taking everybody's
to make sure that those measures
let me put that back. We
them.
don't need to collect everybody's data.
I think we do
to
need
be
to
safe.
collect everybody's data, because that's the only way you can see patterns. Now, I can understand your concerns, Jill. We do need to make sure individual data, there is a balance to it. As my colleague Claude Moraes said, we are very mindful of privacy issues, but you need to collect everybody's data in order to be seeing those bits of data that stand out on their own.
But it's going to be a huge amount of data for 5 years. It is open to misuse, though, isn't it? Because we know that when governments do this sort of thing, I mean, look at the RIPA Act in this country, which was basically designed to get the bad guys, and suddenly it's being used against whistleblowers, against journalist sources, used by town hall snoopers.
But this is why we've ensured that individual privacy has been at the forefront of this. But don't forget, this data is largely computed and analysed by other programs, by analytical programs. So it's not as if somebody can just tap in and look at it. It's amassed, and only those bits of data where there are concerns are shown up.
What do you say to that?
Well, I think that what we've seen in legislation over the years, it's always been in response to something. I think we need to look at what is working, what isn't working, what has been adopted by the member states. But also there was a major focus in the debate on the prevention of terrorism, the prevention of radicalisation and so on. We need to put that at the top of the agenda as well, and really focus on education, on teachers, on social workers, on local police. There's no simple answer to this.
Isn't there a danger that...
Proposal actually does do that.
But isn't there a danger that it could be used that... I mean, I understand that even people's eating meal preferences on airlines is going to be included. Isn't that runs a danger? Oh, let's see who's asking for the halal meats. Let's look at certain names that are there. Let's concentrate on them. Is there not a danger of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand how the food preferences can... Really, that's
well,
a bit
maybe that's why.
Well, this is why we've said it's going to be balanced, and we do need to be able to analyse. And I am confident that the proposal we've had in front of us does ensure that we are ensuring privacy and the balance is right.
Again,
and that's again what Yvette Cooper has said as well, getting the balance right.
Putting your own views aside in terms of prediction, do you think this will get through? Will it become law?
I think it probably will. I'm against it. There are the questions that have been raised by the court that said it wasn't proportionate. And my biggest fear is that we focus on issues like this at the expense of other more effective. I've got your side of the
argument, and I've got yours too. But do you think, regardless of your view, will it be law by the end of the year?
I think
You think it will be?
Yeah, and I think it's important, and to emphasise that we are really working on other preventative measures as well. This isn't something that works on its own.
Okay, well, if the spooks are watching, I quite like the special meals. So you'll see that beside my name. Now, Vladimir Putin is visiting Budapest next week, despite an agreement among EU member states not to hold bilateral meetings with the Russian president in response to the annexation of Crimea. Hungary's been a member state of the EU since 2004, but critics say Prime Minister Viktor Orban prefers to look east to his ally, Mr. Putin, than west to the EU. Our Adam's been for the latest in our series, Meet the Neighbours.
So this is a 44 years old Russian bike. And it works pretty well.
And it comes with Bluetooth headsets, so the perfect way for tour guide Laurent to show me round Budapest.
So actually this is a hero square in Budapest.
Capital of a country that's lost an empire, was occupied by the Nazis, saw Soviet tanks rolling down the streets, and then ditched communism in 1989.
But the most impressive moment I remember well, when it was announced that the last Soviet soldier stepped out the border and left Hungary in 1990.
Hungary finally arrived in the EU nearly a decade ago. Nowadays, one of its biggest exports is controversial headlines about its right-wing Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. He infamously said he wanted to create an illiberal country. His party, Fidesz, enjoys an enormous majority here at Hungary's version of Westminster.
Well, you can see that these protesters want to delete Viktor. He's also been criticised for rewriting the rules for the elections to the Hungarian parliament to favour his party. The EU complained when he tried to rewrite the constitution, and President Obama has compared Hungary to Egypt when it comes to civil rights.
Accusations swept aside by Mr. Orban's spokesman.
He believes in leadership. I mean, this is something which we don't really and quite experience in Europe for the past maybe 2 decades. There are only a couple of exceptions to that. So leadership is essential to have good decisions and political success.
Also having success by the Danube is the far-right party Jobbik. They came second in the European elections here last year, with tough rhetoric about the country's Roma minority and what they call deviant lifestyles.
I have a big problem with gay parades. I don't claim myself the right to have a parade just because I live in a happy sexual and whatever life with my wife, and I don't think that this is anybody's business.
It's all very depressing for the left-wing activists who meet up in Budapest's bars.
I'm really sad about this, and it's not really good to like. I'm traveling abroad, and if I say that, hi, I'm from Hungary, they say that, oh, sorry about that, what's up? How do you handle this? So, like, internationally, this is bad.
Although he was instrumental in organising protests last year, which forced the government to drop plans for a tax on internet use, maybe Mr. Orban isn't quite so powerful after all. Outside Budapest, a reminder of a past dominated by the USSR. And there will be a modern-day strongman from Russia in town next week, President Putin. Hungary, one of the few EU countries where he gets a warm welcome.
European Union was meant to bring us all together, meant us to feel most closely. Are you not worried now about this? Everywhere we look, the rise of extremes, on the left and the right.
Absolutely, and I would say Orban is definitely one of the weakest links. We were talking about Putin earlier, and he's picking Hungary off first. I think it's important. We had a debate in the Parliament this week to try and look at how we address the extremism that is on the rise, and especially countries that allow the extremism to flourish.
Even Sweden now has a nativist hard right movement. What's going wrong?
Well, I think that what we need to do at a European level is to refocus. And I think that if people feel isolated, if groups feel ignored, if people don't feel that they are part of a democratic system building a Europe that's in people's interests, then of course there is a danger that they turn in other directions. We have to really work together in Europe to make sure that that doesn't happen, but that includes building democracy, strengthening rights and having a real social Europe again.
Well, we shall see what happens. I thank you both for being with us. That's it for today. Thanks to all of our guests for joining us on Politics Europe. I hope you'll join us next time. Until then, bye-bye.